Raphael from Curtin University in Western Australia.
I am Mike Alvarez. I am a PhD student at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, in the Department of Communication.
Right. So today we're going to be talking about humanising celebrity suicide specifically. So would you like to first explain why you've come to research that topic?
Sure. Many reasons, actually. Well, what brought me to it was that ever since I was an undergraduate at Rutgers University, I have been studying the relationship between suicide and creativity. Specifically, what fascinated me was I saw this relationship as sort of a paradox. Suicide is the ultimate cessation of one's existence, and yet creativity is the ultimate endorsement of one's existence. And so it got me asking, how can these two things coexist? And some of my reasons are personal too. To speak candidly, I identify as a psychiatric survivor. So the topic of celebrity suicides, of the relationship between suicide and creativity, is highly personal to me.
Right. So are there any particular celebrity suicides that you have been looking at within your research?
Several, actually. Methodologically, I do psychobiographical studies of celebrities who have ended their own lives. Some of the people that I have looked at are Iris Chang, who wrote The Rape of Nanking, and who ended her own life in 2004. The Rape of Nanking is basically exposed some of the gruesome atrocities that took place in China's former capital during World War II. And I also looked at the life of Aaron Swartz, the activist, as they call him, and as well as literary celebrities like Yukio Mishima or Virginia Woolf, Sylvia Plath.
Yeah.
And the list goes on, actually.
Unfortunately, actually. Yeah.
And unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, well, within my research, I've looked a little bit at Robin Williams' suicide. And for me, I was looking at it from the point of view of his lasting identity post-death and how the suicide impacts that brand. Do you have any thoughts on how those suicides do impact celebrity images at all?
Certainly. It's interesting that you mentioned Robin Williams because I'm also fascinated by how we talk, like the public, or talk about suicide, or how celebrity suicide retrospectively colors the life that preceded it, and how the identity is reconstructed in media. And in the case of Robin Williams, I wonder, I don't have any definitive answers, but some of the questions I do wonder about is, there is always, we have this, the tragic comedian persona, and it makes us wonder, does it confirm the tragic comedian persona in some way? And it depends too on how Robin Williams has been looked at prior to his death. And perhaps you can speak more about that, considering.
Yeah, well, that's just it. I mean, as you mentioned, he was known as being a comedic icon, and so for a lot of people, it was this idea that he made them laugh, and he was seen as this happy guy, and for them to then see the depressed side and leading to suicide, it was quite, I think, extra traumatic for fans in a way. So they reacted quite strongly. In particular, through social media, there was a lot of fans tweeting, and sort of other people within the industry as well were tweeting and posting on Facebook about their mourning of Robin Williams, and he inspired so many other comedians as well. So creating this idea of happiness and comedy versus depression and sadness is such extremes of the spectrum. So I think that was a huge impact. But I think although he had such a sad death, he also had such a, his identity was all about this sort of comedic life. And so I think in memory, people will remember that and his films and so forth, rather than his death, which I think is a good thing. I think it should be about celebrating his life and his career,
right, rather
than focusing on that. Having said that, I think, drawing awareness to the issues of depression, I think, is also important. So I think, at least that has come from it as well, which you might be able to speak more about as well in terms of the idea of promoting awareness of depression and how important that is.
Right. And I do agree with what you said about how we should really remember. I mean, besides, of course, the need to raise awareness about suicide and depression is important, but also that we should celebrate the life that preceded it. Because sometimes what happens is when a person commits suicide, it just it has a somewhat fatalistic look at the life that preceded it, and also, and as they say, hindsight is retrospective, and we sometimes fall prey to looking for symptoms that confirm whatever diagnosis we attribute to that person, which is really a disservice to the memory of the person. It can be, I think. It need not be, but it can be.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, I noticed with someone like Kurt Cobain, who also committed suicide, with his death, it almost seems like that is more linked to his identity post-death. In a way, people often associate his memory with his death and the tragedy of that, and the whole sort of rock and roll image, I guess, as well. So I think that's a fascinating sort of, I guess, brand difference between him and Robin Williams and how they're remembered as well.
Especially because since Kurt Cobain's death, he has been placed on the Forever 27 song,
Yes.
which has its own image
Yes.
of dying young at age 27 specifically, but also being a heavy user of drugs, and basically ascending to the pinnacle at such an early age, but burning out really quickly. And also, I would also add that one of the reasons why his image is so closely associated with his death is because he touched upon his songs, particularly the grunge movement, touched upon the angst the existential crisis of so many people of the youth, of so many youths of that generation. And
that's so true. I think that's another strong difference between him and Robin, is that Robin's about comedy and making people laugh versus Kurt Cobain, who was more about representing that angst and the pain of youth. So I think that, again,
the confusion,
impacts on that.
right?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. Right. So tell me more about the research you're doing in terms of the humanizing aspect.
Sure. By humanizing, I really mean placing what we would call symptoms of mental illness within the context of a person's life, but also within the larger context, like social, cultural, and historical context. So I think one of the pitfalls in writing that writers sometimes fall into is diagnosing an individual and then looking for confirmation for symptoms of that diagnosis. And I mean, labels are really just that, they're labels. So when we say depression, what do we mean when we really say depression? Are we saying that it is a condition that is what psychologists or psychiatrists call endogenous, as arising from within? Or are we saying that it is reactive, that it is a tragic response to the human circumstances in our life? And I don't want to go on the record as saying that I, deny biochemical or the medical model of mental disorders. I mean, obviously, if I'm afraid, the limbic system of my brain would light up in your imaging scans. All mood states have distinct neurophysiological signatures. But I think what I want to highlight in my work is that we have been focusing too much on singular causes of suicide, and often this cause that the scapegoat is mental illness, without really considering what we mean by that term. And by humanizing, I mean, for instance, if someone is suffering from hallucination, and Robin Williams actually suffered from hallucinations prior to his death, that fact recently surfaced. And rather than saying, okay, this is failure in reality testing, that obviously he didn't know the difference between what is real and what is not. One of the questions that I want to ask is, what are the contents of these hallucinations? How does this make sense within the context of his life? And so by humanizing, I really just mean putting it back in context. lives, rather than abstracting these, clinical entities from it.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, we've been focusing too much on the biological side of things. We should also kind of look at the phenomenological side of mental illness, depression, and suicide. We should look at that once.
Yeah. So, coming from a psychology background, how did you then move to look at celebrity culture within that?
Sure. So I love psychology, and I will always love psychology. But initially my interest is in exploring the life. I always thought that the psychological study of suicide and creativity will reveal so many of the mysteries of human nature. This is me as a bushy-eyed 18-year-old in college, but my interest has shifted towards larger forces. To give an example, Alan Turing.
Yeah.
I think psychology is important, but we also should be looking at the larger social forces, particularly how, in his case, the general climate and atmosphere around his homosexuality in general, because Alan Turing was charged with gross indecency for having a sexual relationship with a 19-year-old man, and what happened to him was just tragic. He was he was cut off from his work because he worked with classified materials, and he was cut off from access to these materials given the, comparable to the lavender panic of the time, where homosexuals are believed to be traitors of the state or would sell secrets of the state to enemies of the state. And so we have to consider these larger forces too. Not the impact of these forces on him as a person, but also the individual you can't divorce the individual from the larger social context. So that's one shift that my work has to is being more mindful of this. But also, I also began to be interested in how we talk about suicide. Hence, my interest in communication.
Yeah.
How do we discursively construct suicidal individuals, and how do we refashion or repurpose personas, celebrity personas, especially after their deaths?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that as well. Just keep in mind that when Robin Williams passed away, there was a tweet going around of "Genie, you're free" was the message, but everyone started retweeting it, reposting it, went to Facebook as well, and so forth. Then there was this reaction that it was encouraging suicide. You're free now, and that sort of thing, looking at a positive way of it. How do you think that would have an impact on fans? Do you think that is an issue?
I think it would be. I actually encountered the same thing when I was researching Aaron Swartz, who committed suicide in 2013, and it's just, many people would say something along the lines of, because Swartz was prosecuted for trying to rescue the public domain from the private sector.
Yes.
He downloaded millions of articles on JSTOR, and even though JSTOR decided to drop the charges, he was still prosecuted by the and basically many people would say on Twitter, one of the discursive registers that we had Twitter, people would say something along the lines of Swartz committed suicide with the purpose of becoming a martyr, something like that. Or they would wonder if Swartz knew he would be more powerful as a martyr than as a prisoner. And it does bring issues of the ethics of speaking of, because these comments might seem mild, but there's the fear of suicide or media contagion, that comments like these might impel people who are already vulnerable to end their own lives. So sometimes I do think that fears of media contagion, suicide contagion specifically, and I do speak about this in my presentation tomorrow, but sometimes I think that they can be overblown sometimes. But I am of the opinion that we should nevertheless tread with caution.